Eric Bennett seemed like the perfect husband, heartbroken and praying for his wife's recovery in the ICU. But behind closed doors, as his wife's body decayed, he was plotting a new life with a younger woman he'd met online. While Melanie clung to life, Eric was soundproofing a guest room and buying luxury sheets, preparing for the mistress he planned to replace her with. What no one knew was that Melanie's illness might not have been natural at all. With poison in her system, and the clock ticking, the truth would come out in a chilling twist no one saw coming. Eric Bennett was the man everyone admired. He had the look of a family man, and a warm smile that earned him trust at church, work, and around the neighborhood. In Fairview, a quiet suburb where most people left their doors unlocked, Eric and his wife Melanie were seen as the ideal couple. They had no children, but they often hosted backyard barbecues, attended charity fundraisers, and volunteered at local school events. Melanie, a beloved high school biology teacher, was known for her patience and kind heart. Eric, an insurance executive with a calm voice and confident manner, often referred to her as his whole world. So, when Melanie was rushed to the emergency room late one Thursday night after collapsing at home, the town rallied around Eric. He stood outside the ICU in the same wrinkled shirt for days, pacing the halls with red eyes and clutching a prayer book. He updated friends and family daily, sometimes hourly, with long emotional posts about hope, faith, and fighting for the woman he loved. "She's strong," he wrote. "She'll make it through this." Inside the hospital, Melanie's condition was grave and confusing. Her organs were deteriorating, but doctors couldn't agree on what was causing it. She had no history of serious illness. Her vitals were unstable. She was losing weight rapidly and slipping in and out of consciousness. Yet her blood work didn't line up with any common illness. Specialists were called in. Test after test came, back inconclusive. The one constant was that Melanie kept getting worse. Through it all, Eric never missed a day. He brought in blankets from home, played her favorite music, and posted photos of them together from better times. On the surface, he was the image of a devoted husband, but not everyone bought into the performance. A few nurses noted how he rarely asked questions about her treatment. He never seemed confused, frustrated, or angry the way most spouses were in his position. There was a calmness about him that didn't quite fit the situation. To the outside world, Eric Bennett was a broken man clinging to the woman he loved. But in quiet corners of the ICU, behind polite smiles and routine checkups, some of the hospital staff were already asking questions. Because sometimes, the ones who cry the loudest are hiding the darkest secrets. Melanie's decline was rapid, but strange. Just days before she was admitted to the ICU, she had been working full days at school, laughing with her students, and cooking dinner at home. She wasn't just healthy, she was vibrant. Then, seemingly overnight, everything changed. She became fatigued, disoriented, and nauseous. At first, doctors thought it might be a severe flu or some type of food poisoning, but those theories quickly fell apart. Her body wasn't reacting like it should. Her reflexes were slow. Her heartbeat was irregular. Her hair began to thin. And worst of all, no treatment seemed to help. The hospital launched a full-scale investigation into her symptoms. Infectious disease specialists were brought in. Neurologists studied her brain scans. Toxicology tests were ordered, but nothing obvious turned up. Her white blood cell count was slightly abnormal, but not alarmingly so. Her kidneys were failing. Her liver function was deteriorating, but there was no virus or bacteria to blame. It was as if her body was shutting down piece by piece without warning or reason. Doctors considered rare autoimmune diseases, genetic disorders, and even exotic infections, but nothing added up. Her records showed she had no chronic conditions, no history of drug use, and no recent travel. Some whispered it might be stress-related or psychosomatic, but that didn't explain the organ damage. As her condition worsened, Melanie lost the ability to speak clearly. Her words became garbled and slow. Then came the paralysis. She could blink, but little else. Eventually, even her eye movements grew sluggish. Eric remained close to her bedside, always calm, always gentle. He brought her smoothies and thermoses, arranged fresh flowers, and talked to her softly, even when she couldn't respond. Nurses admired his dedication at first, but as the weeks passed, their admiration started to erode. He never seemed to panic. He never pushed for answers. He never once asked about second opinions or experimental treatments. Most family members in his position would be desperate for options, but Eric acted like he was just waiting. And then there were the smoothies. He insisted on bringing them himself every day, even after doctors advised sticking to controlled hospital nutrition. No one stopped him at first. After all, who would question a grieving husband trying to comfort his dying wife? But looking back, that decision would haunt everyone involved. While Melanie's body continued to deteriorate in the ICU, Eric Bennett was leading a second life, one few could have imagined. It had started months earlier, long before his wife's sudden illness. Late at night after Melanie went to bed, Eric logged into dating sites under a different name. He presented himself as a widower, recently healed from grief, emotionally available and financially stable. His profile photo was a slightly older version of himself, aged just enough to seem trustworthy, but not desperate. The lies came easily. He said he owned his home outright, had no children, and was looking to settle down again. That's how he met Chloe. She was 24, new to town, and recently out of a bad relationship. To her, Eric seemed safe. He was older, established, and kind. He listened without interrupting, sent her small gifts, flowers, jewelry, books, and told her she deserved a better life. Soon he was texting her every day, telling her he'd never met anyone like her before. He promised they had a future together. He even told her he had a room waiting in his house, a place she could make her own. All the while, Melanie was slipping, further away, breath by labored breath. Eric began remodeling the guest bedroom without telling anyone. He ordered luxury sheets, scented candles, and framed abstract art that matched Chloe's taste. He soundproofed the walls, saying it was to cut down on street noise. But neighbors noticed the strange timing. He paid contractors in cash, kept the room locked when friends visited, and told Chloe that he was almost ready for her to move in. To her, it was sweet. To him, it was strategy. While the hospital saw a loyal, grieving husband, Eric's search history told a different story. He was reading articles on how to blend families, what women in their 20s looked for in a partner, and even how long grief was expected to last before dating again. Chloe had no idea that the man who called her his new beginning still had a wife on life support. She thought she was part of a romantic story, not the final piece in a deadly plan. Behind Eric's calm demeanor was a man carefully laying the foundation for a life without Melanie, one where her absence wasn't just accepted, but anticipated. By the third week of Melanie's hospital stay, her condition had worsened significantly. She could no longer speak. Her body was thin and motionless, and her eyes barely responded to light. But even as her physical state declined, something else began to rise: suspicion. Nurses and medical staff started to take notice of patterns. That didn't sit right. Chief among them was Anna, a veteran ICU nurse with over a decade of experience. She'd seen grieving spouses before, seen the rage, the breakdowns, the begging. But Eric's behavior didn't match. He wasn't angry or desperate. He was polite, calm, almost too calm. Anna kept a quiet mental log of things that didn't add up. Eric's refusal to let anyone else feed Melanie. His insistence on bringing her outside food when doctors had recommended strict nutritional controls. The fact that he rarely asked questions, even as Melanie's body failed with no diagnosis. Most family members clung to hope or demanded answers. Eric did neither. He just sat, watched, and waited. Then Anna overheard a phone call Eric took just outside the ICU doors. He was speaking softly but clearly, talking to someone about timelines, about everything being ready. His tone wasn't that of a worried husband. It was casual, even upbeat. Anna mentioned the incident to a colleague, and the concern was escalated. Hospital administration, already struggling to understand the medical mystery unfolding in Melanie's body, agreed to a quiet intervention. They installed a hidden camera in Melanie's room under the pretense of enhancing patient safety. What the camera captured over the next several days was unsettling. Eric would arrive in the morning with a smoothie in a sealed thermos. He always waited until the nurses left before feeding Melanie through a straw or her feeding tube, even though doctors had advised against unregulated intake. In one frame of the footage, he was seen taking a small object out of his coat pocket and briefly fiddling with her IV line. The motion was subtle, almost casual, but deliberate. The video didn't offer a close-up, but it was enough to escalate the situation. The hospital filed an internal report, and toxicology samples were ordered again, this time with a different set of tests in mind. Eric had no idea he was being watched. As far as he knew, his plan was working. Melanie's condition was worsening just as he wanted, and no one suspected a thing. Until now, the hidden camera footage was just the beginning of what would soon become a much darker discovery. The subtle actions caught on tape were enough to raise serious red flags, but the real shock came when the toxicology results came back. After months of inconclusive tests and theories, something was finally found in Melanie's system: thallium, a rare and deadly poison, once used to kill rodents but now notoriously difficult to trace in low doses. It was the exact substance her body had been reacting to for weeks, and it was the cause of the organ failure and hair loss that had baffled doctors. Thallium poisoning could mimic symptoms of a range of illnesses, making it a perfect tool for someone with malicious intent who wanted to keep the true cause hidden. Melanie's symptoms, nausea, weakness, confusion, and eventual paralysis, had been written off as a viral infection or rare autoimmune disorder. But now, with the poison confirmed, the pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Eric's strange behavior, his odd detachment, his insistence on controlling her food intake, it all made sense. The hospital immediately took action. A team of detectives was called in to investigate, and a warrant was issued for Eric's home and possessions. They were looking for any evidence that might link him to the poison, and they didn't have to search long. Hidden in a small safe in the master bedroom, investigators found a stash of items that would make even the most seasoned detectives uneasy. There were several vials of thallium, purchased online from a foreign supplier, along with a set of documents detailing Melanie's life insurance policy. But it wasn't just the poison that caught their attention. There were also printouts from dating sites, screenshots of conversations with a woman named Chloe, and even a meticulously kept calendar marked with dates and events, some of which had nothing to do with Melanie. Eric had been preparing for the future long before he even knew if Melanie would survive. His plan wasn't just about getting rid of his wife, it was about securing a new life with someone else. Melanie's death was not a tragic accident. It was part of a cold and calculated scheme. While he had played the role of the grieving husband in public, behind closed doors, Eric had already begun laying the foundation for his next chapter. As the investigation deepened, more details of Eric's online life came to light. The messages he'd exchanged with Chloe painted a clear picture of a man who had been plotting Melanie's death while promising Chloe a future with him. Eric had been moving pieces on a chessboard, not caring who got hurt along the way, so long as he could have the life he wanted. Melanie was just collateral damage. It was clear now that the ICU wasn't the only place where a dangerous game was being played. But as the authorities closed in on Eric, they realized there was still more to this story than they initially thought. With the discovery of thallium in Melanie's system and the mounting evidence linking Eric to the poisoning, investigators began to unravel the full extent of his plan. But even as they pieced together the details of his criminal activities, they found that Eric's meticulousness extended far beyond his attempts to eliminate his wife. He had been far more prepared than anyone could have anticipated. The investigators focused their attention on the timeline of events leading up to Melanie's hospitalization. Eric had begun his poisonings months before Melanie had collapsed that night. He'd carefully monitored her health, gradually increasing the dosage of thallium over several weeks, so the symptoms would appear subtle at first and be easily mistaken for something else. By the time Melanie was rushed to the ICU, the damage had already been done, but the poison's effects had been masked by its slow, insidious nature. Melanie's fatigue, the nausea, the strange weakness, it had all seemed to be part of some rare illness or an autoimmune disorder, which allowed Eric to maintain his innocent facade. What shocked the investigators even more was Eric's cold and calculated method of covering his tracks. They found records of his online research into poisons, and even more chilling, detailed plans on how to fabricate the perfect alibi. He had researched not only how to make Melanie's illness seem like a natural one, but also how to stage his emotional reaction in a way that would leave no room for suspicion. He had studied grief counseling websites and had even rehearsed what to say in front of family and friends. All of this while his wife lay dying in the ICU, unknowingly being poisoned by the very man she trusted. But it wasn't just Melanie's death that Eric had been planning. Investigators discovered that in the weeks leading up to her hospitalization, Eric had been preparing for a new life with Chloe. The guest room, which had been soundproofed and decorated with luxury linens, wasn't just a way to make his mistress comfortable, it was part of his grand design. He had already bought new furniture, replaced the mattress, and ordered high-end sheets. He had even made Chloe feel as though she was the center of his world, telling her how perfect everything would be once Melanie was out of the picture. Chloe, for her part, had been unaware of just how far Eric was willing to go. She believed in the future he promised her. Eric had carefully crafted a persona for himself, one that was charming, attentive, and seemingly bereaved, while secretly plotting a future without Melanie. He had led her to believe that they would build a life together, that he was ready to move on, all while orchestrating the slow destruction of his wife. As the investigation intensified, authorities discovered even more troubling details about Eric's history. He had been involved in several failed relationships prior to meeting Melanie, each ending under suspicious circumstances. The pattern was now undeniable. Eric was a man who had been using women as stepping stones to get what he wanted, without a single shred of concern for their well-being. But the most shocking revelation came when police managed to locate the foreign supplier from whom Eric had ordered the thallium. It turned out that the poison had not only been bought for Melanie, but also for a backup plan, a contingency, in case his first attempt had failed. Eric had intended to poison someone else if Melanie had survived, possibly Chloe herself, to ensure he would be free to start his new life without anyone standing in his way. Now, with everything laid bare, investigators were more determined than ever to bring Eric to justice. His ability to manipulate those around him, to lead a double life while executing his plan with chilling precision, made him one of the most dangerous criminals they had ever encountered. But as the net closed in around him, one question remained. How far would Eric go to preserve the life he had built for himself at the expense of everyone else? As the investigation into Eric Bennett's involvement in Melanie's poisoning grew deeper, police officers executed a search warrant on the Bennett family home. The scene that greeted them was a stark contrast to the sorrowful husband they had seen in the hospital. The house was well maintained, clean, and perfectly arranged, but hidden within the walls of the home were disturbing secrets that would soon come to light. In the master bedroom, a small safe was discovered under the floorboards, hidden behind a false panel. Inside, investigators found several vials of thallium, an unmistakable sign of the lengths Eric had gone to in order to execute his plan. The vials were neatly labeled with instructions on dosage, indicating how Eric had carefully planned Melanie's slow decline. Alongside the vials, there were multiple printouts of Melanie's life insurance policy, carefully highlighted and annotated. It was clear that her death wasn't just a result of his greed. It was the center of his entire plan. The life insurance payout would provide him with the financial freedom to begin his new life with Chloe, without the burden of Melanie's lingering illness hanging over him. The safe also contained other disturbing items, an assortment of documents detailing multiple online personas Eric had crafted, all for the purpose of engaging with women. Among the files were printouts from dating sites, where Eric had used fake names to seduce other women over the past several years. The most notable was his profile under the alias Mark, where he had connected with at least 5 different women, all of whom were unaware of his wife's existence. To Eric, each relationship was simply another piece in his personal chess game, moves made to secure a future that didn't involve Melanie. But it wasn't just the records of his online escapades that were unsettling. In a locked drawer, investigators found a stack of photographs of Chloe, some taken without her knowledge, others that appeared to have been staged. The pictures showed Chloe posing in front of various landmarks and even inside her apartment, as if Eric had been tracking her every move. There was a chilling sense of control in the way these images were stored, almost as if Eric had been documenting her life in preparation for a future that, to her, seemed like a fairy tale, but to him was part of a cold, calculated plot. The guest room, which Eric had been preparing for Chloe's arrival, was equally unsettling. The room had been soundproofed, an unusual step for anyone simply trying to make a guest feel comfortable. The luxurious sheets, the plush mattress, and the candles all pointed to one thing. Eric wasn't just preparing a space for a new lover, he was preparing to begin a new life. But the meticulous attention to detail in the room was just the surface of a far darker reality. The walls had been reinforced to block out any noise, a feature that was unusual for a guest room. The entire setup felt more like a calculated move in a game where Chloe was merely a pawn, a woman who would soon take Melanie's place without realizing she was replacing a woman who had been poisoned by the same man who promised her a new future. Further investigation of Eric's computer revealed a string of messages between him and Chloe, some of which were strikingly normal and others more ominous. He reassured her that everything was in place, that Melanie's condition was worsening, and that soon they would be able to start their life together, free of the constraints that had held them back. Eric's language was eerily cold, as if he were talking about a project he had been managing rather than the fate of his wife. His desire to move on was clear in every word he typed, and with each message, he painted a future that seemed brighter than anything he had with Melanie, but in reality, the darkness of his actions was beginning to unravel. As investigators pieced together these details, they began to understand just how far Eric had gone to manipulate every part of his life. From the carefully crafted online profiles to the meticulous preparation of the guest room, everything had been calculated to lead him to the moment where he could walk away from his past without consequence. But as the authorities closed in, it was clear that his world was about to collapse. Eric had spent years building a web of lies, but now, that web was unraveling, and the truth was coming to light. The man who had been so careful in hiding his darkest intentions was finally being exposed. As the evidence mounted against Eric Bennett, his world began to unravel. Detectives had uncovered his involvement in multiple online relationships, his meticulous plans to murder his wife, and even his attempts to secure a new life with Chloe. But despite all the damning evidence, there was one aspect of the case that had yet to unfold fully: the involvement of Chloe herself. She had been unknowingly caught in the tangled web Eric had so carefully constructed. Now, with investigators digging deeper, Chloe's own life was about to become a pivotal part of the story. Chloe had no idea that the man she was building a future with was capable of the crimes he had committed. Eric had been so convincing, so charming that she believed every word he said. When Eric first told her about his wife's illness, he painted a picture of a tragic situation, one where he was helpless to save his wife, but hopeful that Melanie's condition would improve soon. He presented himself as a man caught between love for his wife and an undeniable connection to her. To Chloe, it felt like fate. She had met a man who was emotionally available, someone who understood her needs and was offering a fresh start. But, as Chloe spent more time with Eric, she started to notice subtle inconsistencies. There were moments when Eric seemed too calm, too collected, given the dire circumstances. He spoke about Melanie's health in a detached, almost clinical manner. At times, he even made cryptic remarks about his future plans, hinting at the new life they could share once Melanie was out of the picture. Chloe, eager to believe in their relationship, pushed those doubts aside. Eric assured her that everything would work out, that Melanie's condition was hopeless, and that he was simply waiting for the right moment to move forward. When the police knocked on Chloe's door to question her about her involvement with Eric, she was initially blindsided. She had no idea that the man she had trusted so deeply was capable of poisoning his wife and attempting to use her as a replacement. The investigators made it clear that she was not a suspect, but they did have to ask her about her relationship with Eric. As Chloe recalled the days leading up to Melanie's collapse, the horrifying truth began to dawn on her. Eric had been preparing for his life with her while Melanie's condition deteriorated. The phone calls, the promises of a new life, the guest room that had been meticulously furnished, it all came together like a horror movie script. Chloe was shaken to her core. She had been part of a grand manipulation, but not in the way she had imagined. Eric had used her as part of his carefully orchestrated escape plan. She was never his true love, just a pawn in his twisted scheme. But the worst part was that she realized she could have easily been next. Eric had been so precise, so methodical in his actions that he could have turned on her at any time, just as he had done with Melanie. The police assured her that she was safe now, but the realization that Eric had come so close to erasing her from his life was enough to send chills down her spine. As the investigation progressed, the authorities began to gather even more incriminating evidence. They discovered that Eric had been in contact with a medical professional who had provided him with advice on administering the poison. There were even texts between the two discussing how to avoid detection. This new information shocked Chloe even further, as it became clear that Eric had premeditated every step of the murder, including how to avoid getting caught. Chloe's fear grew as she understood the depths of Eric's manipulation. The man she had fallen for wasn't just a grieving husband. He was a predator who had lured her into a deadly game, a game where the stakes were life and death. As the investigation closed in on Eric, Chloe knew that her role in his life was over. She had become a victim of his twisted design. But she was lucky. She had escaped the fate that Melanie had suffered. However, for the Bennett family, there was no escape from the truth. Eric's cold, calculated betrayal had destroyed everything, and now he was going to pay for it. As the days passed and the investigation into Eric Bennett deepened, the pressure on him mounted. With the toxicology reports, the hidden camera footage, and the damning evidence found at his home, it was only a matter of time before he was arrested. Yet, Eric continued to play the role of the grieving husband, a man on the edge of losing everything. His calm demeanor, however, now seemed like a mask covering an undeniable fear. The authorities were closing in, and for the first time, Eric seemed unsure of the outcome. The detectives, now armed with a wealth of evidence, moved quickly to arrest Eric. They knew the case against him was strong, but there was still a lingering sense of unease. Eric had been careful, methodical, and calculating in his actions. He was a man who had thought of everything, who had meticulously planned the poisoning of his wife while preparing for his new life. But there was one final piece of the puzzle: Eric's reaction when confronted by the police. When the detectives arrived at his home to place him under arrest, Eric didn't show the shock or disbelief that many would expect from someone who had just been caught. Instead, he remained eerily calm, almost resigned to his fate. His house, once filled with the promise of a fresh start with Chloe, now seemed like a prison. The room he had prepared for her, the luxury sheets, the soundproofed walls, was now a reminder of his twisted ambition. The life he had dreamed of was slipping through his fingers. Eric was arrested and charged with first-degree murder for the poisoning of his wife, Melanie. He was also charged with attempted murder for his plan to involve Chloe in his scheme. But as the police prepared to take him away, something unexpected happened. Eric's lawyer, an experienced defense attorney, arrived at the scene with an offer. A plea deal. The offer was simple. Eric would plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for a reduced sentence. The deal would allow him to avoid the death penalty or a life sentence without parole. The authorities were taken aback by the offer. Eric's cold and calculated actions had left little room for sympathy, but the plea deal would allow them to bring the case to a close more quickly. The idea of a trial with all its public scrutiny and the risk of an unpredictable outcome was tempting, but there was one factor that weighed heavily on the decision: Chloe. Despite everything that had happened, despite the manipulation and lies, Chloe had still been part of Eric's life. Her involvement, while unknowingly manipulated, was still a significant part of the case. Prosecutors knew that a drawn-out trial would only reopen the wounds that had already been inflicted on her. A guilty plea would spare her the trauma of testifying in front of a jury, of reliving the nightmare that Eric had created. As the days leading up to the plea hearing approached, investigators spoke with Chloe one last time. She was shaken, but resolute in her desire to move on from everything that had transpired. The idea of seeing Eric in court, knowing what he had done to Melanie and to her, was too much to bear. Chloe, still struggling with the truth of her involvement in Eric's twisted plans, hoped that this would bring some closure, some sense of justice for Melanie. On the day of the plea hearing, Eric stood before the judge, his face a mask of indifference. The room was filled with tension as he accepted the deal, admitting his guilt in the poisoning of Melanie and his attempt to manipulate and control Chloe. The judge sentenced him to 25 years to life, a fate far less severe than what many believed he deserved. But it was a sentence that would give him time to reflect on the lives he had destroyed. The courtroom, once filled with hope for a new life, was now a place where justice had been served. For Chloe, the closure was bittersweet. She had escaped with her life, but the trauma of being part of Eric's twisted scheme would haunt her for years to come. As for Melanie, her death had not been in vain. Through the investigation, the truth had been uncovered, and Eric's web of lies and deceit had finally been exposed.